Good morning. Today's Tuesday, the 6th of June, and today we're in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we're picking up in verse 9. We're going to read verses 9 through 16, where Paul continues to write to Timothy about how to deal with how to treat different groups within the church. And yesterday we mentioned he talked about older men and women treated as father and mother, younger as a brother or sister. He got into widows, and today we pick up. He's still talking about dealing with widows in the church, but he's getting a little bit more specific here. So, verse 9, he says, "Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work." Verse 11, "But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton, idle against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has a widow, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows." Okay, the language is a little difficult to follow, but let me break it down. It's pretty simple, actually. So, as I mentioned yesterday, it was very common practice in that culture in that day, and in the Middle East still to some degree, for arranged weddings, and a lot of times a young woman, I mean teenage years, would be arranged to marry a man who was an adult, who had, trying to he had established himself. So, mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s even, after he'd established his own business or whatever and was in a place where he could support a wife, then he would marry, and usually it would be a young woman. So literally it was not uncommon to see a woman marry a man twice her age. And as we know, the average lifespan of a man is still, but especially back then, women lived much longer. So let's say she marries a 30-year-old man, she's 15, and he, at the age of 45, he passes away. Well, she's just 30 years old, and has some kids of her own. Well, her kids might be, 15 years old. A young man or whatever, and he gives some advice for that woman. Paul says, "I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the adversary to speak reproachfully." So Paul's advice is that they should remarry. But what about, let's say a woman her husband has passed away, and he lived into his 60s. Now she's 45, and Paul says she's too young. He says, do not put a woman on the roll. Now, what's this roll he's speaking of? They had a group of women who were elderly, who were widows indeed, that the church supported them. And they had a list, they had a roll. And the church came together, and this was their security net. This is how they took care of one another. And to qualify for the help of the church, they had this kind of a criteria. She's got to be a woman who's at least 60 years old, hasn't been married multiple times. She's not a floozy. She is also a woman who is reported for good works. She has brought up her children. She's lodged strangers. She's served the saints. She's washed the saints' feet. She's been a servant. She's relieved the afflicted and diligently followed every good work. That woman should be supported by the church. That's what Paul's saying here. Then he says, but refuse the younger widows, because, you know, they may say they want to serve God, but, you know, they're still flirtatious. They're following after the flesh. They have a tendency to become idle and gossips and busybodies. He says some of them have already been turned aside after Satan. Don't support them from the fund or from the collection for the widows. And then he makes another statement, verse 16. He says, if any believing man or woman has a widow, let them relieve them. Now, what's he talking about there? He's saying basically, if a Christian man or woman has a widow in their family, so maybe it's mom, maybe it's their mother. Instead of the church taking care of them, let them take care of them, and not be a burden to the church, so that the church can take care of those who are widows indeed, those who are totally dependent on outside help. So it's just a very practical advice that Paul's giving to Timothy about how to handle the situation with the widows in the church. If she's 60 years old and she's a godly woman, the church she should be put on the roll, and the church should be able to help. If she's a godly woman, and, you know, she's faithful to the Lord, then the church God's people ought to help her. If she's not old enough, or she, you know, hasn't proven herself to be a godly woman, then let her family take care of them. That's kind of the way I look at it. So what's the application for us? I think the biggest thing is we need to ask ourselves is how do we as God's people how do we treat those in our church that are widows, or let's just put it even more broadly, different from us? It's not really what this text is about, but you know, we have widows in our church, and, you know, it's unfortunate that in one sense it's unfortunate that sometime in our past as a nation we allowed the government to usurp or take over what was once the responsibility of the church. Social programs, Social Security, whatnot, has made it to where they've kind of done the job that at this time anyway, in the history of the church in the first century, the church was responsible to take care of the widows. I think education is another realm in which at one time the church was primarily responsible for the teaching in the community, and now the government's taken that over. Hospitals. Most hospitals were founded by churches. Most universities were founded by churches in the early on. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all those were started by churches, as a ministry. But over time, it becomes secular. But I don't think it changes our responsibility as God's people to take care of our own. How do we care for widows? And let's just put it in a simpler term. For those who can't take care of themselves, those who are needy, I think we need to make sure as a church that we demonstrate benevolence and support those who are in need. I love the fact that the community, the church I serve in, and then the broader community, if there's somebody who has a need that's beyond their ability, say someone has been in a tragic accident, and we've done this many times over the years, and they have huge financial burdens, we'll do fundraisers and different things to come alongside those families and minister to them. And I think that's kind of the application I get from this passage, is to come alongside those who are in need. And in this passage, he's talking about widows who are widows indeed. So that's just the principle I see. So if we apply the specs, I think that the sin would be to neglect these people, and then the principle would be that if somebody has a need, and we have the ability to meet that need, we need to do so. Kind of goes back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. He saw the man in the ditch who'd been robbed and beaten, left for dead, and he, of his own resources, he helped this man. He restored him. The Good Samaritan. And someone would say, well, who's my neighbor? Well, I've always been taught that my neighbor is anybody who has a need that I have the ability to meet that need. If I can help, then I have a responsibility to do so. What about examples to learn from? Well, I just gave the example of the Good Samaritan. If there's a widow, it's hard to imagine having never been through that, the devastation. Somebody who's been your best friend, your confidant, your lover, your soulmate for many years, and all of a sudden they're gone like that. The sense of loss, feeling lost, alone, loneliness, all those things. Sometimes all you can do is just be there. Let them know that you're there, you care, and grieve with them, but know that, there may come a time when, especially a woman, can't do yard work or can't keep up with things around the house. There's opportunities for ministry there. What's the command here? I think the command is I think it's implied. I think it's implied that we need to be responsible stewards. We have a responsibility to take care of those who have a need, as a good Samaritan, as a good neighbor, as part of our family of Christ. We have that responsibility, and it goes back to the command that Jesus gave. By this men shall know you are my disciples, because you have love one for another. And the last letter, T, what to be thankful for. I'm just thankful for God's family. I'm thankful for the church, and I know that we're not perfect, and I know that many times I'm sure we fail, but I don't think it's because of ill intent. I think it's just out of neglect sometimes. But I know that when there's a need, and we're aware of the need, we have a lot of people in God's church who would give you the shirt off their back to help. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for that spirit. That's all I have for today. Hope you have a blessed day. We'll see you again tomorrow.